King Charles I and Queen Henrietta Maria had 9 children, but only 6 of their offspring survived infancy and early childhood. Only 5 of these would reach adulthood. 2 of the sons would of course go on to reign as kings, Charles II and James II, while the third surviving son, Henry Duke of Gloucester, would sadly die aged only 20, just as his brother Charles returned to England at the restoration of the monarchy. Of the daughters, the Lady Mary, the eldest, was the first British princess to hold the title Princess Royal, in emulation of French practice, and would marry William II, the Prince of Orange. She would go on to be the mother of William III, who from 1688 would rule Great Britain with his wife and first cousin Mary, the daughter of James II. Lady Henrietta, the youngest daughter, was born during the English Civil War. She barely lived in England at all and was brought up at the French court, and she would join the extended French royal family and would be in a loveless marriage to her first cousin once removed, Philippe, Duke of Orleans, the brother of Louis XIV. She would die at the age of 26. And then there is the 6th of the children who survived beyond early childhood, a figure often overlooked, the little-known Lady Elizabeth. Born in 1635, she died aged 14 in 1650, the final 8 years of her childhood overshadowed entirely by the troubles and cares that engulfed England during the English Civil War, and she is the subject of this video. As we will see, when she died in September of 1650, Elizabeth was not buried in a lavish royal tomb in Westminster Abbey or Windsor Castle, but in an obscure burial vault below the communion table of St Thomas's Church in Newport, now known as Newport Minster, on the Isle of Wight. Her grave was more or less forgotten, as she was for many centuries. She still lies there. The Lady Elizabeth, or Princess Elizabeth if you will, princess was a title that was only just coming into use in England in this period, was born on December the 28th, 1635, in St James's Palace, then a retreat within the Royal Park to the north of the Palace of Whitehall, which was the centre of the royal court. Potential marital alliances were already being discussed within a year of her birth, and her maternal grandmother, Marie de Medici, suggested William, Prince of Orange, as a possible groom. He would of course later marry her sister. In the 1637 painting of the eldest children of the King and Queen, Anthony van Dyck portrays little Elizabeth with a bold string of pearls around her tiny neck, holding her infant sister Anne, who would sadly die in 1640. We know little of Elizabeth's life until late 1642, when aged only 7, her whole world collapsed as England was plunged into bitter civil war. Her mother, Henrietta Maria, left for The Hague in February of 1642 with her elder daughter Mary, ostensibly to raise money for the king's cause, while her father, the king, went north and was in the Midlands raising forces to fight on his behalf. It may seem rather odd to us that the King and Queen did not have their children with them, but royal children in this period rarely lived with their parents. While they were infants, they were placed in the care of a governess until they were then old enough to have their own household established. The royal nursery was at St James's Palace, and in 1642 Elizabeth and her younger brother Henry, Duke of Gloucester, who was only 2 at the time, lived there in the care of their governess, Mary Sackville, Countess of Dorset. From 1642, for the rest of her life, Elizabeth, although cared for, would be under virtual house arrest. London, of course, at the beginning of the Civil War was in the control of Parliament, and the Long Parliament made provision for the guardianship of the royal children, charging Philip Herbert, 4th Earl of Pembroke, with that task. Pembroke had been a favourite of both James I and Charles I, but disagreeing with the king's personal rule, had sided with Parliament. It is unlikely that the royal children at this stage would have noticed much difference to their routine. They were allowed to play, and it seems that in 1643 Elizabeth broke her leg and had to spend time recuperating. Their education continued uninterrupted, and by the time she was 8, Elizabeth could read and write in Hebrew, Greek, Latin, French and Italian. A firm grasp of theology was a part of an education of every young member of the royal family and nobility, and what the Puritan parliamentarians were keen to do was to mitigate against any possibility that Elizabeth and her brother would follow the Roman Catholicism of their mother, and an effort was made to ensure they followed sound Puritan doctrine. In the summer of 1644, with the Civil War now in full swing, the life of the two young royals began to change. They were removed from St James's Palace to Chelsea, where they were lodged in the residence of Sir John Danvers. Sir John, who was an MP, was a refined gentleman who was fond of architecture and gardening, and he lived in some style in his house in Chelsea, so the two were well provided for materially. In 1645, at the death of their governess, Lady Dorset, they were then placed into the guardianship of the 10th Earl of Northumberland, another powerful magnate who had broken with the king. They were then lodged at Zion House, the Earl's estate on the edge of London, and in 1646 they were joined there by their 13-year-old brother, the future King James II. Elizabeth's father, the king, was captured in June of 1647, and he was first brought to Caversham Park near Reading, and the royal children were allowed to see him there on July the 16th and spent 2 days with him. It was the first time Elizabeth had seen her father in 5 years. She spent time with him during his house arrest at Oatlands Palace and then at Hampton Court, before he then made his escape in November. The children were still at Zion in early 1649 when their father, now captured again, faced trial and was condemned to death. Sir John Danvers, in whose Chelsea house they had once lodged, was among those who signed the king's death warrant. The day before the king's execution at Whitehall, Elizabeth and her brother were taken to St James's Palace and allowed to see him. Elizabeth, who was then aged only 11, wrote an account of this last meeting with her father that was published extensively after the Restoration, and it makes for tender and pitiful reading. It is entitled in a somewhat childlike way, "What the King said to me on the 29th of January, being the last time I had the happiness to see him." She begins writing in a prose that's very good for an 11-year-old. "He told me he was glad I was come, and although he had not time to say much, he had better say it rather than write it, as he feared their cruelty was such as that they would not have permitted him to write." She says, "He wished me not to grieve and torment myself for him, for that would be a glorious death that he should die, for the laws and liberties of this land, and for maintaining the true Protestant religion." He told her he had forgiven all his enemies, and hoped God would forgive them also, and he commanded her and all the rest of her brothers and sisters to forgive them too. He requested that she and her little brother be obedient to their mother, and he gave them his blessing and embraced them, she says, before they were told to leave. She would never see him or her mother again. Before her father's death, Elizabeth had written to Parliament to request that she could leave the country with her brother and go to her mother, who was then in France. The decision was delayed until April 1649, and then her request was denied. At that point, both children, still in Zion House, James II had escaped, were placed in the care of a man called Sir Edward Harrington. Later in 1649 they were sent to Penshurst Place in Kent and put in the guardianship of Robert Sidney, 2nd Earl of Leicester, and his wife Dorothy Percy, the sister of the Earl of Northumberland. Parliament was insistent that the two children should be treated with no more respect than would be afforded to the child of a noble, but they were treated well by the Leicesters, who became rather fond of them. In the summer of 1650, Elizabeth's elder brother, Charles II, landed in Scotland to take the throne, and suddenly she and Henry were a threat. With the king only recently executed, Parliament feared an insurrection in London in their name, and so the decision was made to remove them from the country. As a preliminary to this, they were to be sent to the Isle of Wight, and they were to be lodged in Carisbrooke Castle, under the guardianship of Captain Anthony Mildmay, who had of course been the jailer of their father while he was held there. Parliament allowed £3,000 a year for their upkeep, but their household was to be reduced to only 8 servants. When her removal to Carisbrooke with her brother was first suggested, Elizabeth wrote to the Council of State of the Commonwealth and protested that her health was not robust enough for such a lengthy journey, and complained at the reduction of her household, but that was to no avail. The 2 children and their small entourage arrived at Carisbrooke in August of 1650. Within weeks, Elizabeth had fallen ill, it is said, with a cold, and she died on the 8th of September 1650, a few weeks short of her 15th birthday. It is a sad fact that her freedom was on the horizon at the time of her death. For 3 days before she died, the Council of State of the Commonwealth had agreed that she could leave England and go to her sister Mary. Poor Henry would have to endure incarceration alone at Carisbrooke for a further 2 years. Contemporary sources give us several glimpses of Elizabeth's personality. She was evidently a well-read and intellectually gifted young woman. Contemporaries praised her for her fine mind and her learning. She was also evidently a very self-assured girl. Writing to Parliament and protesting aged 14 at the reduction of her household must have taken considerable courage. Her life must have been distressing. To be parted from her parents, to know of her father's fate, to face uncertainty and constant change at such a young age must have forced her to grow up quickly. Writing in the 19th century, the biographer Mary Everett Green stated that Elizabeth had a disposition of profound melancholy and deep resignation. I'm not sure how that can be determined from the sources, but a life lived in such turbulence does leave a mark on the young. As we'll see in a moment, there are other reasons to believe Elizabeth had great courage, as it seems quite likely that she was suffering from a serious and debilitating disability. Elizabeth's body was embalmed and placed in a lead coffin, and it lay in state in the castle for 16 days, presumably so her burial vault could be prepared. It was purposely made. On the 24th of September, her body was then taken in a borrowed coach the short distance from Carisbrooke to Newport, attended by only her household servants. As the cortege entered the town, it was met by the mayor and aldermen, who escorted it to St Thomas's Church. We can assume that she was buried, like her father had been at Windsor the year before, with little or no ceremony and without the reading of the burial service from the Book of Common Prayer, which was then banned. No gravestone was placed over the site of her vault, only the letters E.S. for Elizabeth Stuart were engraved on the wall to mark the spot. In October of 1793, some workmen who were digging a grave for Septimus West, the son of Earl de la Warr, came across Elizabeth's vault. Closing it up again, this brass plate was then affixed to the floor to mark the spot more permanently. By 1854, old St Thomas's had fallen into decay, and over the course of the next year it was entirely rebuilt, and during this work the burial vault of Elizabeth was disturbed once again. This time her coffin was opened and the remains of the princess were examined by Dr. Ernest Powell Wilkins, a local physician who had a strong interest in antiquarian matters. The account of his investigation was published in a local magazine by a journalist called George Hillier, and a brief account of the findings can also be read in William Adams' The History and Antiquities of the Isle of Wight, which was published in 1856, and engravings were made and circulated at the time that showed the interior of the burial vault and the coffin of Princess Elizabeth. It appears that Wilkins' work was not done with a great deal of sensitivity. That, or the examination of a young woman's remains, simply offended Victorian sensibilities, and the people of Newport denied all knowledge that it had ever taken place. When the British Archaeological Association came to Newport in August of 1855, nobody was prepared to acknowledge or talk about the vault having been opened. They asked Mr. J.H. Hearn, a local solicitor and antiquary, if he knew of it, and he said he had not seen a report and believed the account of the opening to be altogether fictitious. Well, Wilkins' written account of the opening of the vault later came to light, and it was published in full in 1918 in a magazine called The Practitioner. There was enough distance in time to ensure all involved in this terrible affair were dead. Wilkins himself died of an opium overdose in 1881, having suffered years of ill health. So what did Wilkins see? Well, once the brick-lined vault was opened, the coffin was immediately seen, resting on supports above the floor of the vault. The coffin of Princess Elizabeth was made of lead, and it measured 5 foot 3 inches in length. And like many coffins of the period, it had a ridge down the centre and sloping sides. Presumably, it was once contained in an outer wooden case, which had long since perished. On the lid were 3 strips of lead with an inscription that confirmed the identity of the occupant. Elizabeth, second daughter of the late King Charles, deceased September the 8th, 1650, it read. We can see the inscriptions as they appeared in these engravings. The coffin was then opened. Inside it was evident that there was once an inner wooden coffin which had mostly rotted away, and there were a few inches of semi-liquid matter at the bottom of the coffin. The princess's remains were skeletonized and in quite poor condition, although her long brown hair with touches of auburn in it was still well preserved. There was some evidence that Elizabeth had been embalmed, with packing materials placed within her abdominal and thoracic cavities, as you might expect in this period, and there was a recess within the vault too that had once evidently contained her heart and viscera, removed at embalming. The bones of Elizabeth, Dr. Wilkins argued, revealed much evidence of her poor state of health. However, we have to take some aspects of what he says with a pinch of salt, for he spends a couple of paragraphs in his account discussing the phrenology of Elizabeth's skull. He says that the most prominently developed region of her skull was the region of cautiousness, which, overdeveloped as hers was, indicated despondency and despair. Pseudoscience aside, if you'd lived the life of Princess Elizabeth, you would perhaps be prone at times to despair. Wilkins believes he found significant evidence that Princess Elizabeth was disabled. The bones of her upper arms were curved outwards, while those of the forearm were somewhat twisted, he says. The spinal column had a major curvature. Both femurs were curved forwards and inwards, with the right one particularly distorted, and her legs were of unequal length. Overall, he concluded that she was greatly deformed, that her trunk would have been uneven, and that she would have had knocked knees with her feet turning inwards. His conclusion was that she suffered from an advanced case of rickets. That is quite plausible. Rickets was a disease that was rife in early modern England, peaking in the first half of the 17th century, and it was a disease that seemed to affect the rich just as much as the poor. However, it's also possible that some of the issues evident in her skeleton were inherited. Both her father, Charles I, and grandfather, James I, had issues with their legs. Charles could not walk unaided until he was 7 and had to wear reinforced boots to strengthen and straighten his crooked limbs. The vault was sealed again just prior to the completion of the rebuilding of the church, but there is evidence that before Wilkins left, he removed from the vault things he shouldn't have taken, which may explain the tight-lipped attitude of the people of the town. In Newport in the later 19th century was a shop called the Old Curiosity Shop. It was run by a man called William Ledicott, and in the window of his shop Mr. Ledicott had on permanent display a rib bone and a quantity of the princess's hair that he said had been taken from her coffin. He also had in his possession a rubbing of the top of the princess's coffin showing the inscription, which seemed to prove the provenance of these anatomical specimens. In the end, Ledicott was persuaded to give these morbid relics to Queen Victoria's daughter, Princess Beatrice, who was governor of Carisbrooke Castle. The rib bone was discreetly reburied back in the princess's vault, while the hair was taken into the care of Carisbrooke Castle Museum. It can still be seen there, along with the 17th century mourning ring that supposedly contains a fragment of the dress which Elizabeth was wearing when she died. In 1854, Queen Victoria commissioned a new monument to the princess for the church. It was designed by Baron Carlo Marichetti, Victoria and Albert's favourite sculptor, who would of course carve their tomb. 2 designs were produced and executed by Marichetti. A tradition was circulating at the time that the princess died while reading the Bible, and so the first iteration of the monument portrayed Princess Elizabeth kneeling, collapsed at a kneeling desk, with her limp body laying over an open Bible. In 1856, this design was rejected by the Queen, and a second effigy was carved by Marichetti with a figure of the princess lying in repose, her head resting on the Bible. The effigy of Princess Elizabeth is set within a stone arch, and it is placed just metres away from her burial vault, and above the effigy is an iron grille like that of a castle portcullis, representing the princess's years of incarceration. It is a very beautiful and emotive effigy without doubt, but I think it is perhaps rather too sentimental and pathetic an image to memorialise a young woman who, though dealing with great hardship and pain in her life, was a person of strong intellect and spirit. Thanks very much for watching. If you like my YouTube channel, you are bound to enjoy my monthly magazine, The Antiquary. Existing readers enjoy it enough to give it 5 stars on Google Reviews. The magazine ships worldwide and is available in print and digital formats. Until the 31st of May, I have a sale on all my back issues, which is a good opportunity to stock up on any of the 22 previous issues. That's over 60 beautifully illustrated articles on a wide range of historical subjects.